Crane reached out to you and said, would you like to come? What did you expect? What do you expect coming up here for the next couple of days?
I was very flattered that David had contacted me. I'd obviously worked with him in Freetown. I knew that prior to the establishment of these dialogues that the international prosecutors had often got together, at least on an informal ad hoc basis, and when I was still working in Freetown, the prosecutors met in Freetown and I was invited to participate in that discussion. Mm-hmm. So I think I had an expectation that it would be a similar forum but expanded and extended.
And here you are in Chautauqua Institution. Did you know anything about Chautauqua?
No, I of course instantly did a Google search, which is what everyone does these days.
You should probably tell us what to expect, other than Elvis Costello waiting for you.
Exactly.
How did you get into business?
One might be tempted to say that, you know, stolen at birth by gypsies, but it was actually well, being a lawyer, it was, and being a criminal lawyer, a domestic criminal lawyer in Australia, it was something that I had always been quite interested in. And I had spoken to some people in Australia who'd been judges on international courts. Mm-hmm. And so on. And I had actually gone across to Edinburgh to do my PhD in international criminal law, and while I was there, was offered the position in Freetown. And my PhD supervisor was of the opinion that I should suspend my candidature and go and do it, and that's how it came about. So I spent 2 years in Freetown working on the two rebel trials there, the AFRC trial and the RUF trial, and after, you know, the malaria and the typhoid and everything else got the better of me, really, and really as it came to a logical break point, the close of the AFRC case, I thought it was time to hand that over to someone else.
Were you there at the beginning where David Crane was?
No, I was not. I came in well prior to the trial starting, but after the indictments had been filed.
What's the sense in Freetown about the trial itself? It's been going on for a little bit here.
It has. I think it has the general difficulty and also welcome that most international missions or UN missions have. That is that on the one hand there are people who see the white Land Rovers and the money spent on the court and say, we have no water, we have no electricity, we have no medicine, why can't we just have the money? On the other hand, you have people who are incredibly grateful that that the international community is interested and concerned with what happened to them, and there were people in Freetown who turned up every day to watch the trials. And that dichotomy was brought home very in a very real manner to me. Very shortly after I arrived in Freetown, I had gone up country to McKinney, which is in the middle of the country, and was speaking to some people, and a woman sort of collared me and said, "You're one of the prosecutors?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I know the man who raped me. He lives in the village next door. Why aren't you prosecuting him?" And you can explain all the things in the world that you want about it being an international crime and greatest responsibility and so on, but ultimately I had to acknowledge that I had no answer for her. And that to me is very striking vignette of that difficulty that international courts have, particularly when they sit in the seat where the conflict took place.
Was it more difficult, you think, for you to the fact that you did not have an answer because you're a woman talking to a woman?
I don't know. I suspect that she wouldn't have said what she said to a man. Mm-hmm. So in that case I was, I think, chosen by her for that question. But I would think that any of the men that I worked with there would have had the same difficulty, the same moral difficulty that I had in trying to answer her without fobbing her off, but at the same time being honest with her.
The time period you were at Freetown was what?
Was January 2004 to November 2005.
Now, Had Taylor been arrested at that time?
No, he was arrested at the beginning of 2006. I was supervising if you like, reading the evidence on Taylor as it came in at the time, and there was always great hope that Taylor would be arrested, but it seemed actually quite a long way off at the time that I was there.
As you were reading the evidence, what form did it come in? Affidavits? Did it come in videos like this here?
No, it was coming in the form of the occasional witness statement, the interviews that the investigators had done with witnesses, some financial records and other records that the investigators had managed to get from quite frequent trips to Liberia.
Just for the tape, what's he alleged to have done?
He is alleged to have been responsible for a number of the atrocities not committed directly by him, but by the rebels in Freetown. It's a very complex story, but in a very simplistic way, he was instrumental in the arming of the rebels and the exchange of diamonds and other things for arms. So the real issue for the prosecution was always being able to prove the knowledge that he had as to what the arms were for.
And you've seen some of the evidence, and I realize the case, I think the prosecution case is rested.
It's now closed, yes.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the defense starts?
It starts soon.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting. I have actually seen a number of documentaries, interestingly enough, at various places around the world, interviewing the defence team in Taylor. And who knows what the performance in court will be, but certainly to the cameras, the principal defender was saying that it was an outrage that he had been arrested, and he was only arrested because he was black, and so on. So it seemed that there was a great deal of the African issue being portrayed in the media, whereas I've always thought that their stronger defence, and the one that I would choose to run if I was defending him, would be precisely that issue, that can the prosecution prove the knowledge that is necessary.
Right.
So it'd be interesting.
You, without giving away any confidences, but you saw obviously enough to support the indictment.
Certainly, at the time I saw, and from what I understand, and I haven't been involved in this since the end of 2005, that there was further evidence that came in afterwards. But I feel quite competent to talk about the other trials, but less so about the Taylor trial, because it really developed most after I left.
What were the other trials you were involved in?
The other trials were what were called the two rebel trials, the AFRC trial and the RUF trial. In the world of acronyms, the AFRC were the African Forces Revolutionary Council. The RUF were the Revolutionary United Front. The RUF had been having skirmishes, I suppose is the word, since '91 in various parts of Freetown, but not various parts of Sierra Leone, but not in Freetown itself. In '97, there was a coup d'etat in Freetown, and the AFRC took government. They were originally soldiers from the 1st Battalion of the Royal Sierra Leonean Army who seized power. But they had obviously been planning for some time, because on the day that they took power, they actually had government-printed gazettes and so on. One of the amazing things that came out, one of our best witnesses, who had been reasonably high up, told us that it was the soccer team that was the actual backbone of the people involved in the coup. And we didn't know that until it actually came out in evidence. It was quite interesting. They then invited the RUF to join forces with them, and together they ruled in a military junta for just about 12 months. And they were sacked from Freetown in beginning of '98, and they then escaped, fled Freetown, went up the east side of the country, wintered, I suppose is the word, in the wet season up north, and then decided to make another bid for Freetown, and Freetown was invaded again in January of 1999. And the jurisdiction of the court was in that latter part from 96, and the atrocities committed by the rebels as they left Freetown and then on their way back to Freetown, not to mention the invasion of Freetown itself, were the prime stuff of those two trials.
And your role in all that was sort of, you do the investigative?
No, I was the senior trial attorney of the trial team that did both of those trials. There was the second trial team that did the CDF trial, which were the government forces.
Right.
So my role was to marshal enthusiastic and keen others to get this material ready and to present the trials. And the AFRC trial ran quite well, and the prosecution case went from about February-March of 2005, and it closed in October 2005, and that was quite a speedy trial. I was quite pleased with the way that went. The RUF trial went more slowly because it was being heard by the other trial chamber, which was doing a month on and a month off,
Right.
interspersed with the CDF trial, so it was a far slower process.
And the results?
The results were good. They're all settled now and have been through the appeals process, and there were a majority of convictions on everyone who had been indicted was convicted on a majority of matters. One of the very interesting things is that those trials produced the first ever world convictions for the recruitment and use in hostilities for child soldiers, terrorising the civilian population, and the issue of forced marriage as a crime against humanity, which was always a very interesting issue for us because it came in the other category, and that was in the AFRC trial. By 2-1 they were acquitted of that at trial, but the appeals chamber overturned that, and it's something that everyone in the OTP, I imagine, that was involved in that would be quite proud of. It was a very hard-fought battle, not least because we were criticised even in the world of academia for laying the charge. So,
well, congratulations.
thank you.
Last year we had Grace Acalo here. She was a child soldier, and it was very moving because she talked about being forced into that responsibility. Did you get to know any of these?
Yeah, they were an interesting group of kids. We had more boys than we did girls. Some of them didn't know their real names, their dates of birth, or what villages they came from, and they are, of course, both perpetrators and victims. And some of them still had absolutely no moral compass whatsoever, had no idea what was right and what was wrong. Others had better insight into what they were doing, and it's a real issue for the country as to what happens to these now young men, now young women.
Right.
But they were forced to do the most dreadful things. In fact, a lot of the amputations that were performed in the violence, which was somewhat of a signature of the violence in Sierra Leone, were performed by the children, and they were formed into what were called cut-hand groups, and were forced to perform the amputations with machetes. And of course, one of the sadnesses is that there's very little medical assistance of whatever kind, let alone any kind of counselling. So the difficulties of helping children deal with their past, I think, is a very real one for the country.
Dave Crane just had a meeting with 100 and some students, and I hope you get a chance to meet them. And he did the ring around, the arms,
yes,
as a reminder, and it was so moving.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of just what you said. When you first saw, and I'm sure you did, the results of some of this.
Yes.
How did your emotions? I mean, how?
It's incredibly confronting. And especially because there are no skin grafts, there are no prosthetic limbs, there's nothing.
Right.
So you would see people who had suffered an amputation 5-6 years prior, and the wound was still bandaged. and still weeping. And in a society which is absolutely subsistence, if you don't have a hand, let alone if you don't have two hands,
Right.
your chances of survival are pretty awful. And there were people who were absolutely destroyed by it. And there were people who were not, and there was one witness that I will never forget. He had the most horrific story amongst horrific stories. And he described his amputation, which was in a village way out in the bush, and miraculously he survived with blood loss and so on. His children helped him until he ran into the arms of people who could help him.
Right.
And it was one small part of this very terrible story. His wife had been gang raped, and he'd seen people put in a hut and it set on fire, and it was just horrific. And after he'd told all of this story, he actually broke down when he described the rape of his wife. And for an African man to cry in public is really quite something. And the court adjourned for a moment, and I remember walking outside and talking to one of the defence counsel, and we both just went, we're pretty close to tears ourselves, at this point. He then came back and described his amputation, and what I found extraordinary is that he wasn't angry. He actually stopped and he said, and at that point I said, thanks be to God, because this is how he wanted me to be. And I do not know what reserves of strength and decency that man has, but it's quite extraordinary. Quite extraordinary.
Day in and day out, Lesley Taylor watches, observes, reads, listens to this. How does that impact a prosecutor? I mean, I realize you're trained, but this is tough stuff.
It's incredibly tough stuff. It makes you think about really big things, of course.
Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer that in the heart of man there is darkness, and given the right circumstances we are all capable of doing very bad things. But there were some things that were done that I just do not recognise that I have the capability of doing, and which leads you to think, how does that happen? How is it that people behave in this manner? The way that you cope is by supporting all of those around you, and they support you. And credit where it is due, David Crane and then after him Desmond de Silva were very good leaders in that respect and made sure that everyone was all right, ultimately. And people, you have your good days and your bad days, and you get out occasionally.
You got to get away, don't you?
Got to get away.
And you got away. Where did you go? Did you go to Europe? Did you go back home?
Back home was always about a 40-hour flight prospect, so it wasn't always convenient to go home. So generally Europe, and was mesmerised by things like showers and flicking a light switch and there being electricity, and being able to walk into a supermarket and there being food. Occasionally I did actually travel in other parts of Africa, including in West Africa, because Africa gets in your skin a bit. Yeah.
You're married?
I am.
And how do you explain this to your husband?
We weren't husband and wife at the time. He is also a lawyer, so he has some appreciation of what I was doing. It's always very hard to explain exactly what it was like, but he's very supportive of it. And after I came back from Africa and resumed practice in Australia, I was then the following year offered to do some work in East Timor after the great violence that had happened there in 2006 for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and he said, go, this is important, go. So he's actually very supportive of this kind of endeavour.
East Timor, I know, and I must tell you, I'm a lawyer by trade. I'm not an international criminal lawyer. I'm a transaction corporate lawyer in Jamestown, New York, that started the Jackson Center. So know where I'm coming from, because I'm pretty naive about this. But I've always heard about East Timor, and I don't know anything about it. Could you explain a little bit about what it was that was created there, and what they were
Sure. Very potted history. For many years, East Timor, or Timor-Leste, as it's called, was a Portuguese colony for hundreds of years. The Portuguese left in 1975, and for a brief time, East Timor was independent. But then the Indonesians invaded, and East Timor was under Indonesian rule until the referendum in 1999, and East Timor is once again its own country. There was a great deal of violence perpetrated against the East Timorese by the Indonesians during their period of occupation. The great resistance hero is, of course, Xanana Gusmao, who led the guerrilla fighting. People like José Ramos Horta and others happened to be outside of the country in 1975, so they spent their time gaining international support for their cause, at first with a great deal of resistance and more. There's a great deal of shame about the Indonesian invasion. Australia knew that it was going to happen, America knew that it was going to happen, and basically walked out and let it happen. Mm-hmm. Following the referendum in 1999, there was more violence, and there's been Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and there have, of course, been tribunals set up to deal with violence. For a while, East Timor was the poster child of the UN, I suppose, fledgling democracy and so on. It all broke down in 2006 when there was a spate of violence. The Minister for Police was arming sections of the police for his own purposes. Discipline broke down in the army. There was protesters killed on the streets. It ultimately culminated in the police and the army, whose headquarters are quite close to each other, engaging in firing on each other, which is far from the sign of a healthy democracy. The army personnel were disarmed and marched unarmed through the streets of Dili under UN escort. The commanders wearing, they had actually taken off their blue helmets, but they're wearing blue vests and carrying UN flags. And a number, 6 in fact, army officers, or soldiers at least, if not officers, opened fire, and 9 were killed and 27 were injured. It was in fact rogue action. There was a Special Independent Commission of Inquiry established by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and that was one of the investigations that we investigated. I was counsel appointed to that inquiry, and recommendations were made. The difficulty being that because the institutions of democracy are very weak, in times of stress and trouble, people rely on personal allegiances rather than the democratic institutions, and so power breaks down. It has the potential to sort itself out. It can be a very rich country because of the natural gas and so on. Fingers crossed it does, but it's got a very long road to go.
What's the status now?
The status is it had elections late last year, early this year. Xanana Gusmao is now the Prime Minister. Previously he was the President, and José Ramos Horta is now the President, and previously he was the Prime Minister. They are doing their best. One of the difficulties that I see is that there hasn't been generational change. The leaders in 75 are still the leaders, and there needs to be some youngsters who are given a go.
As far as your investigation and your involvement there, what was the end result of that?
We had the power to make recommendations, and recommendations were certainly made about the democratic institutions. We also made recommendations that quite a number of people be prosecuted, including the 6 soldiers that we identified as shooting the police officers, and a number of other people who were involved in looting and setting fire and so on. There haven't been any prosecutions.
Was that because the United Nations just hasn't created the tribunal, or?
No, they were to be domestic prosecutions for things
domestic.
like
Okay.
murder and so on. So it was within the grant of the Prosecutor General. So the UN had no power to enforce that.
Okay.
But it is disappointing that they haven't taken place.
There was some discussion about potentially a tribunal for crimes in Burundi.
Yes,
Has anything come of that?
not that I'm aware of.
Last year we had the former ambassador, United States Ambassador Robert Kruger here
Mhm.
to talk about his time there, and he was sort of lobbying for that to happen. As you reflect back now, whether it was the Sierra Leone, East Timor, will you go back again?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have thought about it. I have actually been involved in a very, very large case in Australia. I've been prosecuting a large terrorism matter, which has taken 2 years. So I've kind of been out of the game, but I do have itchy feet for it. I think it's difficult, and I think that the institutions are often very far from perfect, but I think it's a very worthwhile cause.
Any particular tribunal you'd like to say you'd like to get back into this one?
It's interesting because you have interests, I suppose. The International Criminal Court is interesting, obviously, because it has the broadest jurisdiction, but it's a bit like being an ambulance chaser, I suppose. You're looking at where these terrible things are taking place. I think a very interesting. I'm very interested to see what happens, I guess, is what's happened in Sri Lanka. And are the Tamil Tigers gone? Are they really gone? What was the process of doing so? What's the Tamil minority living like now? I'm interested to see whether there's any tribunal established with respect to Sri Lanka. But really, if you have a set of skills and you can use them, you can probably go where they need it.
Do you, and this is maybe a dumb question, but it seems like there, and many of the prosecutors and the speakers and panelists, and they've gone to a variety of jobs within the tribunals, plural. It seems like a small world.
It is.
And as long as you're in that world somehow, or you let people know you'd like to be in that world, there's probably a spot as long as there's an interest. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is. It's. I think that if you're interested in that kind of career, the hardest thing is getting the first job. And as long as you're not an idiot and work hard, I suspect that's right. And there's certainly, I think the UN term for it is mission junkies, who travel around the globe. So, but I think that probably is a fair assessment.
I see they've created a tribunal in Lebanon.
Yes.
David Tolbert, who is now the registrar, previously had been at the number 2 person at the ICTY, and sort of has worked his way now, and he was hoping to come here today, but there's a whole lot of things going on. Are these people you keep in touch with, the folks who are still in the game?
Yeah, certainly. I have many friends and colleagues from my time, and certainly am in contact with them, probably not as frequently as one would like or one should be, but I have a great deal of admiration and affection for the people. Yeah.
Because, I mean, not only are you here, but there are a number of women who have been prosecutors in various forms. And do they get their due, or is there, in a sense of equal recognition for the work, or is there still sort of a good old boy network? Do you get any sense of that?
I don't know. All I can say is that I certainly, well, I should perhaps be careful about what I say. With the people that I work with within the ITP, I never for an instant felt that there was any difficulty whatsoever with my gender and the fact that I was the senior lawyer. I think it's interesting for women, especially when the court is not sitting in a European country or a more modern Western democracy, because if you have children or so on, it's far more difficult to take them to a Freetown or whatever. And so the women in the court tended to be bright young things who've just finished their master's degree, who are full of enthusiasm and are miles away from marriage, children and so on.
Mm-hmm.
The old boilers like me were few and far on the ground, and my personal circumstances were such that it was an appropriate place for me to be. I didn't have those concerns. Having said that, occasionally in the courtroom I had difficulty with a couple of the judges because of my gender.
Was there?
Yeah, refused to call me by name or call me Madam Prosecutor or so on. And one of the judges, in fact, actually asked the registrar why a woman was in charge, which I found extraordinary in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that upset me about that was not me. I'm big enough and ugly enough to deal with myself. But it upset the young 20-something women on my team. And that was unacceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And I was not going to let him bully them because he couldn't bully me. So,
Where do you recruit folks to, the young 20-somethings? Where do they come from?
they come from all around the place who have an idea of that this is the career that they want to do. Often they've just finished a master's degree in international law and are keen to go out and tread the boards. And it's actually quite an exciting process because you see people and you have to let them have their head, but you also have to rein them in a bit and give them a bit of guidance and explain that things aren't always as they seem on television.
Mm-hmm.
But to a last person, the people who came were great.
Is your path, have they crossed with Fatou Bensouda?
I did meet her in Freetown when she came for one of the prosecutor's discussions, but not since then.
Tomorrow at 1:30 there's going to be a movie of which you're invited called The Reckoning.
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen that.
I haven't.
The Battle for the International Criminal Court, and both the producer and the director are coming in from Massachusetts to be part of it, and Christine Chung and Fatou are portrayed in the movie, and you're all invited to come see that because I think this is an opportunity for our community to see the interactions of the ICC, to see the investigative reporting, to see some of the trials and tribulations type of thing. Are you following Charles Taylor?
I do. I read what I can when I can on the Special Court website. But because he was a head of state and so on, even in the faraway press of Australia, there is occasionally an article. So yeah, I do follow it.
What's Australia think about Barack Obama?
Australia thinks that he's pretty grand, I imagine. Certainly my friends think he's pretty grand. My husband and I actually got up at 4 o'clock in the morning so we could watch the inauguration.
Terrific.
It felt like a very historic moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it was. Professor John Barrett, Lesley Taylor?
We did meet.
Okay.
Briefly in the lobby. So,
She's terrific.
what's no doubt.
What is we're
I was
talking?
at that inauguration. It was very cold. So
It did look very cold.
It was very cold.
Yes. I couldn't imagine sitting there actually.
Right.
So
Summer in Australia was probably much more comfortable.
it was.
We've been talking about Sierra Leone. We've been talking about East Timor. What's the question I should be asking Lesley Taylor? What am I missing?
Depends what information you're trying to elicit.
It's much easier asking this question of other folks. These prosecutors. What are you trying to get there? But it's just about the subject matter that we have here. Obviously, it's women in international law, and that's a focus of the 2 days worth of the conference. And as this was being generated by Betsy Anderson and David Crane, among others, and you, even as you look at this, is this an accurate portrayal of what we should even be talking about?
I always think that the gender issue is a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, unless you acknowledge women explicitly, there is a bit of an old boys network sometimes. But in acknowledging women, you can slip into the danger of making them a special class, a somehow lesser class, an other rather than the norm. I don't think that that is an issue that is unique to international law. It happens at my own bar. For that very reason, I choose not to be a member of the Women Barristers Association, because I do not want my practice to be qualified by my gender. Having said all of that, having read the various versions of the program that came out, and when David first contacted me, my gut feeling is that the program has struck the appropriate note. It's not all touchy-feely. There's real substance to it, and the truth is that women as well as men have contributed to the modern development of international humanitarian law.
John, what's the question?
How far are we away from the date when a gender focus will be an anachronism, where it's just an integrated men and women practice?
I would hope towards the end of my practicing life. I think it has the potential to do that. I don't think it's 5 years away.
And is the international criminal law realm leading or trailing national experiences in this regard?
I mean, I can only compare the international world to my own domestic world. It leads Australia. Partly because Australia, unlike the North American system, we divide lawyers into solicitors and barristers. Solicitors are more akin to what you would understand lawyers to be, work in firms, see people, see clients and so on. Barristers are specialist advocates. I'm a barrister. I don't work in a firm. Ethically, I have to work for myself. I'm not allowed to incorporate. I'm not allowed to see people off the street. I'm briefed by solicitors to go to court. The division is that most women who become lawyers are solicitors. At my own bar, less than 10% of barristers are women. And it's still the last bastion of maleness. That can be difficult sometimes.
What's the entry gate? How do people become barristers, or how is that?
You need to be a lawyer, so you need to be admitted to practice. And generally speaking, you are admitted to practice to be a solicitor and barrister. So solicitors have a right of appearance. They can appear in court. They tend not to do complex matters, but magistrates' court work and so on, they do. If you wish to be a barrister, you then have to apply to the bar in your state, which is again used because a solicitor society is called a law society. So the bar doesn't refer to everyone, it just refers to barristers. You have to what's called read, be the pupil of another barrister who is not senior counsel, that is a QC, or no longer in Australia an SC, who's of not less than 10 years standing. You do a bar readers course, which is an intensive 3-month advocacy training type course. You then sign the bar roll and hope like hell that someone briefs you. There are different ways of organising that. So we work in chambers and we have barristers' clerks who kind of look after fees and answer your phone if you're not there and so on. So it's quite an anachronistic way of doing things. It's the Irish practice. So the bar is still very male, and male in the negative sense as opposed to the neutral sense. And internationally I found that not to be the case. I think primarily because of the great influence of the North Americans, the Canadians, and the Americans think that our legal system's crazy. And, you know, it doesn't work that way. So,
Is there an Inns of Court type of thing, or is that what your legal...
That's the English system. We don't have Inns of Court, but other than that, we work very, very similarly to the English way of doing things, except in my state, which is the Irish way of doing things. So,
why is that?
A great influx of Irish Catholics at the founding of Victoria. which is the state that I live in. And so we have, it's very similar but slightly different.
It says you are a Vincent Fairfax Fellow at the St. James Ethics Center, a not-for-profit organization which provides non-judgmental forum for the promotion and exploration of ethics.
Yes.
What's that mean?
There is a fellowship in Australia called the Vincent Fairfax Fellowship. Sir Vincent Fairfax was the patriarch of one of the great families of Australia, the Fairfaxes, who own media in Australia. Sir Vincent was a great philanthropist, and one of his great wishes was that for young Australians that there would be a leadership program that promoted ethical decision making. And after his death, his family established a fund for the fellowship for the promotion of not ethics and leadership, but ethics in leadership. They were very, very clear about that. It's a program that is open to Australian citizens only, generally aged between late 20s and late 30s. There's no professional grouping that you must be. And there's somewhere between 12 and 15 of these fellowships awarded Australia-wide each year. And the program is extraordinary. Mm-hmm. It's not full-time. It runs for about 18 months and it goes in blocks. And the first month that they make you go away, you have to fly to Darwin, which is the capital of the Northern Territory. It's frontier land in Australia. And they then hand you over to two people who are both ex-SAS soldiers and make you trek in the Catherine Gorge for 5 days in summer. So it's incredibly humid. It's 100% humidity. It's about 45 degrees Celsius and you're carrying a very heavy pack. And the idea is to put you under physical stress without killing you, obviously. Yeah. And for the group to get to know each other, to get to know how you respond to certain things. And after that, you spend some time in Darwin with the Aboriginal people, the traditional owners, learning about Aboriginal culture. There's still a very great divide in Australia between Aboriginal culture and the rest of Australia. And the third part of that is that you're sent to one of the mines in Australia. Mining is incredibly important to the Australian economy, but it clashes very much with land rights and so on. So you spend 10 days at a mine. I happened to be at sent to a bauxite mine and an alumina refinery, so I had to actually work shifts at the mine. But I also had to go and spend time with the local Yolngu people to hear both sides of the coin, and ultimately you have to write a report about that kind of experience. And the fourth part of that month is going to Canberra, the capital, where you have briefings with quite senior public servants and ministers and judges and so on, and so engage in the sort of politics of Australia. Right. They then ask you then go home and try and process all of that in your daily life. The next part of the program is that they ask you to perform community service in your own community that you are not otherwise performing. And they ask you to choose something that is going to challenge you. They in fact ask you to identify a character trait that you think you can improve and to choose your community service along those lines. And so I volunteered at a men's soup kitchen for the 18 months. In fact, it continued a little longer afterwards. And that was confronting and interesting.
What was the trait that you were addressing through that?
The trait was shyness and engaging. As a lawyer, I can go into court and argue till I'm blue in the face, but it's not me. I have my armour on. But it's that engaging the personal as well as the professional, And in that situation, you're only ever allowed to use your first name, and you're certainly never allowed to say what you do. So outside of that space. And I chose a men's shelter because there are only 2 in Melbourne, the city where I live. And men's health and men's problems, the cycle's gone around, and it's not as sexy, I suppose, as the issue of women and children. So there's a great need for space for men. And one of the things that I was interested in that process is that I assumed that most of the men would be older, and they weren't. They were very young, and they either had very bad drug problems or they'd just been released from prison. So I had to engage with these incredibly angry, often, men. And so that was a huge learning for me. The program continues, and a few months later they gather the group back together, and they have a retreat. So you're given a whole stack of readings, everything from your classic philosophy to writings of Islamic women about whether you should wear the burqa or not wear the burqa or whatever. And you're asked to write responses to all of these and to engage in hypotheticals and so on. And the following year you then are given money, and you have to write a proposal to go and do some research in Southeast Asia, being the focus being Australia and in Australia's region. And you have to go off by yourself for 3 weeks, and you're asked to take things at face value, propose a question, go and look at this, and again write a report about that. And I travelled to India, and I looked at the development of the common law in the post-colonial period. Of course, I wasn't in the country for 2 minutes before I realised that I completely asked the wrong question, because it's a rights-based country now, and has been since 1947. And they thought that I was a bit odd, sort of, doing that. But again, that was amazing. I met some wonderful lawyers and wonderful people.
Where were you located?
I was in Mumbai for 2 weeks, and then I travelled by train across the country to Calcutta. And I chose those 2 because they're 2 of the old British seats. So rather than go to New Delhi, I thought I'd go to where the heart of the British Empire had been, and in many ways still is. But and then after that, travelled to Thailand to attend a regional conference where we were looking at issues of identity, gender identity and ethnic identity. And it's the most amazing gift, I think, that I've ever been given. And in my group, there was one other lawyer, but there was a doctor, there was a school principal, there was a cheesemaker, there was a theatre director. The idea being that you don't have to be the next Prime Minister to be an ethical leader. They want to affect people wherever you are. And it changes you. It's breathtaking. So yes, I'm a Vincent Fairfax Fellow and very grateful for it. And annually there's a symposium of the alumni.
How long has it existed?
I was Group 7, and in fact the symposium was just a couple of weeks ago. I was up in Sydney for it, and Group 14 graduated. So the eldest fellows are now approaching 50, and the youngest fellows are in their late 20s. So there's a...
Has there been a Prime Minister who's emerged from this group?
No, there's not, but there's a couple of... Well, there's one judge. There's some people who are heads of departments in government. So, as well as the people who are teachers in the outback,
Right. Cheesemakers.
Cheesemakers, yeah. So
What a wonderful thing.
it is. It's an extraordinary gift. It really is.
In the Monty Python movie, Blessed Are the Cheesemakers.
Yes, exactly. The cheesemaker is actually now a very good friend of mine, and if I had thought that it would travel, I would have brought some of her cheese, but...
Might have gotten messy.
Well, this has been terrific. Thank you. You're welcome to join us for dinner.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're going to just go off the grounds for a little bit, but we'll get everybody back by the time it's Elvis Costello, because she knew that he was coming. That's why she came Saturday.
Ah, okay.
No, I didn't actually. It's a lie. But,
That's a good line.